their fresh troops are these Western trained troops who have now gone back to Ukraine for the counteroffensive, particularly something called the 10th Corps, which is the Ukrainian sort of special reserve force, which they've been keeping back, waiting for the breakthrough and then using this corps for the breakthrough. And what we hear today is that elements of this 10th Corps are now being used on this advance towards Melitopol, which suggests, as I've said, that the Ukrainians have finally decided that, with the weeks going by, with winter not so far away, with the need to show their Western backers that all of this effort really is having some kind of good effect, that I think they've decided to commit themselves, always risky, but I think they realize that they have to sort of do what they can, go for broke even. And so the engagement of the 10th Corps now seems to suggest that we're at the point of the battle with the Ukrainians now making their supreme effort.
Start by looking at Ukraine, where the push to break through heavily fortified Russian lines is being compared to the Normandy landings in its significance. Fierce battles are underway in the Zaporizhzhia region, involving thousands of Western trained and equipped Ukrainian reinforcements in what appears to be the most significant phase so far of Kyiv's counteroffensive. Joining me now is Jamie Shea, who's the former Nato Deputy Assistant General Secretary for Emerging Security Challenges. Jamie, thank you for joining us today. We often like and see when we're reporting on conflict around the world, pretty sort of statements that are dripping with hyperbole and saying that this is akin to the Normandy landings in significance is pretty up there. But this really is what Ukraine has been building to in planning for a counteroffensive, hasn't it? This is going to be key to what happens next.
Yes, good afternoon, Ruth. There are some parallels, of course, between the Ukrainian counteroffensive and Normandy, in the sense that the Allies in 1944, after D-Day, were also sort of bottled up in Brittany and Normandy for several weeks, probing the German lines, trying to find the weak spot where they could break through into open country and then pursue a full-fledged offensive to victory. And that, of course, is certainly what the Ukrainians have been doing over the last month or so along 1,000 kilometers of front, probing the Russian lines, again, rather like the Allies in 1944, where eventually they found something called the Falaise Gap and poured through that, looking for that vulnerable point. But as you say, Ruth, I think, after all of these probes, the Ukrainians have now sort of settled on a single line of advance, the one that makes most sense for them, south of Zaporizhzhia, as you said, down to Melitopol, on the Sea of Azov, trying to sort of break the Russian-held territories in two, therefore isolating the Russians in the west and trying to fold up the Russian lines. But of course, they need a sort of a stroke of genius in terms of achieving the breakthrough in the way that Eisenhower and Montgomery and Patton were able to do it back at the end of World War II.
And it's not unopposed. This is not like an advance into free country, because as well as the actual Russian troops that are there and that are dug in, you've got the landmines that have been laid, you've got the tank traps that are there. The fact that there wasn't open hostilities for much of the winter period meant that there was time for fortifications to be put in.
You're absolutely right. In hindsight, if you're a sort of a strategist looking at this, you probably would think that perhaps the Ukrainians shouldn't have poured so many troops, resources, and effort into defending Bakhmut, which became the single focal point during the winter. They managed to sort of hold the line there, although eventually they lost Bakhmut, but they prevented a Russian breakthrough. But clearly, by focusing really exclusively on Bakhmut, they didn't really pay attention to the Russians digging in south of Zaporizhzhia, in the south, fortifying their position in Crimea, laying all of those mines which you refer to, and which has now, of course, made their advance so incredibly difficult. The problem is, as you rightly say, is that the Russians, having created these sort of four layers of defense with Dragon's Teeth tank traps and mines and artillery, and also having air superiority, are making it very hard for the Ukrainians to use successfully what they thought would be their sort of winning asset. Those Leopard 2 tanks, those Challenger tanks, those armored personnel carriers, which the NATO countries have given them over the winter and the spring, they're proven to be very vulnerable, of course, to landmines. And so the Ukrainians have had to sort of dismount and advance soldier by soldier, which is very costly in terms of lives and very slow in terms of progress.
And in terms of the soldiers themselves, many of these are fresh. They've not been pulled off of different lines or from different conflicts. They've been undergoing sort of training in the West, including in Britain, actually, and are kind of almost like a new reserve that are being thrown in.
Absolutely correct, Ruth. I'm agreeing with everything you say this afternoon. Yes, the Ukrainians have
You're going to
got
have
a
to stop that, Jamie.
no.
Because my,
Well,
my my knowledge is
I'll
at least
find
20
a
years out of date since I was doing my Sandhurst training.
you're very kind in inviting me, Ruth. So I will find a pretext eventually. No, but I agree with you on this because yes, their fresh troops are these Western trained troops who have now gone back to Ukraine for the counteroffensive, particularly something called the 10th Corps, which is the Ukrainian sort of special reserve force, which they've been keeping back, waiting for the breakthrough, and then using this corps for the breakthrough. And what we hear today is that elements of this 10th Corps are now being used on this advance towards Melitopol, which suggests, as I've said, that the Ukrainians have finally decided that, with the weeks going by, with winter not so far away, with the need to show their Western backers that all of this effort really is having some kind of good effect, that I think they've decided to commit themselves, always risky, but I think they realize that they have to sort of do what they can, go for broke even. And so the engagement of the 10th Corps now seems to suggest that we're at the point of the battle with the Ukrainians now making their supreme effort.
Well, let me put you on the spot for a moment. In your expert professional opinion, what happens next? Does Ukraine make enough of a breakthrough that we start to see Russian positions overrun and a change to the Russian strategy?
It doesn't seem likely at the moment, Ruth, given the way in which the Russians are so well dug in, and all of these reports that they would run out of missiles or that their soldiers would have poor morale doesn't seem to be panning out. Of course, it's easier to keep morale in an army which is defending fortified positions than losing a lot of soldiers attacking. I think the Ukrainians will succeed in gaining more territory and pushing the Russians back, but I think the conclusion will also be that they'll need another spring offensive next year if they're going to be able to finish the job. And therefore, the real issue for the West is, will the Western countries have the money and the patience, the fortitude to continue to sort of supplying Ukraine and modernizing its army in the hope that a second spring offensive would produce better results than this one. But all of those who support Ukraine have to hope that eventually they will find the Russian breaking point and they will achieve at least sufficient success before the winter to persuade the NATO countries that the support for Ukraine is still going to achieve a good result at the end of the day.
Okay, Jamie Shea, former NATO Deputy Assistant Secretary General, thank you so much for joining us.